October 14th, 2016. A quiet night in Savannah, Georgia. 27-year-old Samantha Lee left a coffee shop near River Street just before midnight. The walk home should have taken less than 10 minutes. She never made it. Cameras at the café showed her stepping out with a small bag in hand, wearing a gray jacket and a green knit hat. At 12:12 a.m., she sent a final text to her boyfriend. "On my way." That was the last message she ever sent. By morning, her roommate realized Samantha had not come home. Police were called. The search began. Officers combed River Street, the boardwalk, and the narrow alleys leading to her apartment. They found her bag and her green hat near a path by the river. Her phone was recovered nearby, powered off. Detectives interviewed witnesses. A couple claimed they saw a man in a black jacket walking behind her. A taxi driver remembered a call from the same area around 12:40 a.m., but the passenger never showed. No one could confirm what happened in those missing minutes. The case turned cold. Weeks passed. No body, no suspect, no arrest. For years, Samantha's family pressed for answers, holding vigils, pushing police to keep the file open. The community grew restless. Rumors spread. Fear set in. Then, in 2022, investigators reopened the evidence. A tiny fiber on Samantha's hat was tested using new DNA technology. The match shocked everyone. It pointed to Mark Johnson, a maintenance worker who lived in the same neighborhood. He had been overlooked in the early days of the case. In June 2023, Johnson was arrested. At trial, prosecutors presented the DNA evidence and linked him to Samantha's disappearance. The jury returned a guilty verdict. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. 7 years after Samantha vanished, the case finally closed. For her family, it was justice delayed but not denied. For the city of Savannah, it was a chilling reminder that danger can hide in plain sight. If you want to understand how investigators pieced this case together, stay with us. In the next part, we'll go deeper into Samantha's life, the last hours before she vanished, and the crucial details police nearly missed. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every interaction helps us keep these cases alive and bring more stories like this to light. Samantha Rose Lee was born in 1989. In the fall of 2016, she was 27 years old and living in Savannah, Georgia. She had a steady job as a graphic designer for a local travel company that promoted the historic River Street district. Her friends said she was good at her work, dependable, and always prepared to take on extra projects. For her, Savannah was not just home. It was the place where she wanted to build her future. She rented an old apartment not far from the riverfront. The neighborhood was known for its restaurants, shops, and tourists. But late at night, it grew quiet. Many residents considered it safe. But some streets had poor lighting, and the walkways along the river could feel isolated. Samantha shared the apartment with a roommate, Grace Turner. The two had agreed to split rent and bills, and both appreciated the convenience of being close to downtown. The arrangement gave Samantha independence, but it also meant that when she disappeared, Grace was one of the first to realize something was wrong. Her friends and co-workers described Samantha as sociable and creative. She was often seen with her camera, capturing scenes of Savannah's cobblestone streets, the old buildings, and the crowds along River Street. She shared those photos on her social media accounts, where many followers admired her sense of style and her ability to make the ordinary look striking. To those around her, she looked like a young professional with a solid path ahead. Her family life was stable. She was close to her mother, Maria, who lived outside the city, and to her younger brother Alex, who was in college at the time. Family members visited often, and Samantha stayed in frequent contact with them. She had also been in a long-term relationship with Ethan Carter, who worked in the hotel business. The two had been dating for years and were planning to get engaged in 2000. She enjoyed simple routines. She was not a heavy drinker and usually spent evenings with friends at a coffee shop or a small bar. Because she lived close to downtown, she often walked home instead of driving. The distance was short, but the streets were poorly lit. To her, it felt like an ordinary routine. To investigators later, that walk became the most important part of the case. In the days before she vanished, there were small details that would later seem important. Samantha received several messages from a social media account that friends could not identify. They were not threatening, but they were strange enough to notice. She also told Grace about a man who had been staring at her near a parking lot. She dismissed it, saying it was probably nothing. She did not report it to police. At the time, those details seemed minor. After her disappearance, they became potential red flags. On the night of October 14, 2016, Samantha was last seen at her favorite coffee shop. It was late, just before midnight. She was wearing a gray jacket and a green knit hat. That hat would later become one of the most recognizable symbols of her case. The cafe's camera recorded her smiling at the owner, Linda, as she stepped outside. Nothing in her body language suggested fear. At 12:12 a.m., she sent a short text to Ethan. "On my way." That was her last message. From that moment, she walked into the night. The route to her apartment should have taken less than 10 minutes. Investigators later retraced every step. She would have left the cafe, turned onto River Street, passed the boardwalk, and headed toward her building. Along the way, she entered stretches of sidewalk with dim light, patches of fog, and almost no late-night traffic. The evidence showed she never made it home. Her roommate Grace expected to hear the door open, but by morning Samantha's bed was empty. Grace tried calling her phone. It was off. That was when she contacted Samantha's family and alerted police. By sunrise, investigators were already canvassing the streets. The first items they found were chilling. Samantha's bag was on the ground. The details about Samantha's life mattered. They gave investigators a baseline. She had no reason to vanish. She had a solid career, close ties to family, and a future she was actively planning. The unusual messages, the man seen watching her, and the personal items found near the river all pointed to an external threat. Detectives would build their case on those facts, not on speculation about her state of mind. In the early days, officers interviewed her family, her boyfriend, her roommate, and her co-workers. None of them gave any indication that she had plans to disappear. Ethan confirmed the last message he received. Grace confirmed the time she last saw Samantha leave the apartment earlier that evening. Maria and Alex emphasized that Samantha was reliable and would not cut contact. All of it reinforced the same conclusion. Whatever happened on the night of October 14, 2016, it was not voluntary. This foundation, Samantha's stable life, her normal routine, and her sudden disappearance, framed the entire investigation. The missing pieces would be found not in her psychology, but in the evidence left behind. And that evidence would lead detectives to focus on the exact minutes between leaving the cafe and the discovery of her belongings near the river. Those minutes became the heart of the case. And in the next part, we follow that walk, step by step, into the darkness of Savannah's riverfront, where Samantha Lee was last seen alive. On October 14, 2016, it was a quiet Friday night in Savannah. The streets downtown had started to thin out. Around 11:45 p.m., Samantha Lee left her favorite café on River Street. She was wearing her gray jacket, a green knit hat, and carried a small bag with her phone, wallet, and some work papers. The cafe owner, Linda, later said she remembered Samantha smiling before she walked out the door. That was the last time anyone who knew her saw her alive. The security camera inside the cafe captured Samantha stepping outside. She looked calm, not rushed, not worried. In the background, the footage showed something strange, a faint shadow near the riverfront. It was too far to identify, too grainy to say for sure who it was. The route from the cafe to her apartment was short, 7 to 10 minutes on foot at most. She would have turned along River Street, walked past the boardwalk, crossed a small wooden bridge, and then climbed a short hill toward her apartment. It was a path she had taken many times before, but that night the conditions were different. A layer of fog had rolled in from the river. Streetlights along the path were dim, some flickering. The waterfront was quiet, with almost no traffic after midnight. That short walk became the most scrutinized stretch of ground in the entire investigation. Around that same time, a couple walking home reported seeing a young woman heading down River Street. She matched Samantha's description. They also remembered a man in a dark jacket walking behind her at some distance. They couldn't be certain of his identity, and they didn't see any interaction between them. Still, their statement gave police a possible lead. If Samantha wasn't alone, then someone else had been moving in the same direction. Another resident who lived near the docks came forward with a different detail. He said that at about 12:20 a.m., he heard a single sharp cry. It was short, over in an instant, and he couldn't place exactly where it came from. He assumed it was a drunk passerby or someone fooling around by the water. The sound seemed so brief that he didn't investigate further. Only later, when news of Samantha's disappearance spread, did he realize it might have been important. His account was logged into the case file, though it lacked the precision investigators needed. When police began retracing Samantha's route, they found disturbing signs. Near a narrow path leading down to the riverbank, they discovered her green knit hat on the ground. A few feet away lay her small bag. Her wallet and documents were still inside, untouched. And close by they recovered her phone, switched off. These items suggested Samantha had not simply wandered away. Something had interrupted her walk. But the scene had no clear signs of violence. No blood, no drag marks, no torn clothing. At first glance it looked almost staged, objects neatly left behind without the usual traces of a struggle. For detectives, there was, however, one anomaly. Imprinted in the dirt near the wooden bridge was a partial shoe print. It didn't match Samantha's footwear. It appeared larger, consistent with a man's shoe. Investigators couldn't determine much more at the time, but the detail supported the theory that someone else had been there. Just as police were piecing these findings together, they ran into another setback. A security camera positioned near the bridge had stopped working earlier that night. The outage lasted from 12:05 to 12:20 a.m., precisely the window when Samantha would have passed by. That failure erased what might have been the most crucial piece of evidence. It left detectives with a gap at the exact moment the trail went cold. Back at the apartment, Samantha's roommate, Grace Turner, noticed something was wrong. Around 2 a.m., she woke up and realized Samantha still hadn't returned. She tried calling, but every attempt went straight to voicemail. At first, she thought maybe Samantha had stayed with Ethan or decided to crash at a friend's place. By morning, when the bed was still empty, Grace panicked. She called Samantha's family and then reported her missing to the police. By 8 a.m. on October 15th, the case was officially active. Officers began canvassing the riverfront, checking alleyways, questioning anyone who might have been out that night. The timeline was quickly built. 11:45 p.m. Samantha leaves the café. 12 a.m. She sends a final text. On my way. 12:20 a.m. A resident hears a short cry near the river. 2 a.m. Grace notices Samantha is still missing and tries to call her. 8 a.m. Police begin the formal search. That sequence became the backbone of the case. Each entry marked a narrowing of her window of disappearance, from the last confirmed sighting to the discovery of her belongings. The fact that her hat, bag, and phone were left behind indicated she hadn't left voluntarily. The phone going dead within minutes of her final message added urgency. Something had happened in those 10 minutes of walking distance that erased her from the city. For investigators, the lack of direct witnesses was the most frustrating part. The couple who thought they saw her couldn't provide much detail about the man in the dark jacket. The neighbor who heard the cry couldn't pinpoint where it came from. The broken camera meant no visual record of the crucial moments. Each piece was incomplete, leaving the picture unresolved. What was clear was that Samantha's disappearance wasn't an accident. People don't drop their phone, bag, and hat neatly by a path and vanish into fog. The absence of robbery, her wallet was untouched, ruled out a simple mugging. The evidence pointed toward abduction or worse. For Savannah police, this marked a turning point. What began as a missing person case now looked like a criminal investigation. The belongings at the riverfront were treated as crime scene evidence. The shoe print was photographed, the phone was sent to digital forensics, and the area was cordoned off for further examination. But even with these steps, the trail was already cooling. Hours had passed since the likely incident, and any potential witnesses had moved on. The fog that night had also made visibility poor, reducing the chance that someone might have noticed details from a distance. By the end of the first 24 hours, the outline of the case was set. Samantha left a café, walked into the fog, and never reached her apartment. The last signals of her presence were a text, a faint sighting, a possible cry, and her belongings scattered near the water. After that, nothing. This missing stretch of time, from the café to the riverfront, became the heart of the investigation. Detectives knew that the answers to Samantha's fate lay within those 10 minutes. And in Part 4, we turn to the search that followed. How police, family, and volunteers launched a massive effort to find her, and why, despite everything, the trail seemed to vanish into thin air. At 8 a.m., the search became official. Savannah police set up a mobile command post on River Street. Officers marked off the path where the green hat, the bag, and the phone had been found. They built a grid and assigned teams: shoreline search, camera recovery, and witness interviews. K-9 units swept the boardwalk and the grassy embankments. A patrol boat pushed along the river's edge in slow passes. A drone lifted into the fog and traced the shoreline, pausing over coves and the wooden bridge. Weather notes went into the log. Light fog, low wind, a changing tide. Those details would matter later if anything had drifted. The evidence team moved first. They photographed the scene from every angle, then again closer, then again with scale markers. The hat and bag were sealed and labeled. The phone was bagged, battery state recorded, and queued for digital forensics. Technicians scraped soil and grit within a 10-meter radius. They lifted possible fibers from the bag strap and the knit exterior of the hat. Near the bridge, they pressed casting compound into a partial shoe print and waited for it to harden. A technician sketched a scaled diagram of the site and noted where streetlights failed and where shadows pooled. All of it would help reconstruct what the camera had missed. While the scene was processed, another group began pulling video. They started at the café and moved outward. Shop fronts, hotel awnings, a marina office, a parking lot gate. Detectives then moved to the first interview wave. They spoke with Linda at the café. She described Samantha's last minutes. Calm, smiling, no argument, no one trailing her inside. They talked to Grace, the roommate, to lock down patterns and timing. Usual route, usual habits. The last text at 12:12, when she would normally arrive, and when Grace realized something was wrong. Ethan confirmed the text, handed over his call log, and described where he was that night. The couple who reported a man in a dark jacket sat for a formal statement and worked with an artist on a basic description. The resident who heard a brief cry pointed to where he stood at his window and which way the sound carried. Investigators measured the distance and noted the interference from river noise. The second interview wave went door to door. Officers knocked at buildings that faced the water and those behind the main strip. Who worked a late shift? Who walked a dog near midnight? Who fished by the docks? They questioned security guards at a garage and front desk staff at a nearby hotel. Night staff notice patterns: who lingers, who cuts through, who looks out of place. The marina office provided dawn logs for small boats. If a vessel left earlier than normal or without lights, it would be checked. The goal was simple: map movement, confirm who was where and when. At the same time, digital forensics started. The phone went on a write blocker. Analysts pulled text threads, app logs, location pings, and Bluetooth handshakes. They checked how many steps the phone registered before it went dark, and whether a smartwatch had paired that night. Cell tower records were requested to place the last signal in a sector and narrow the arc. Investigators compiled a list of social accounts that had messaged Samantha in the week before she vanished, including the anonymous handle that friends had flagged. With a court order, they asked for the IPs and device types that accessed that account. If those IPs overlapped a location near River Street at the right time, it would tighten the circle. City Wi-Fi and private routers along the path were also queried for MAC addresses observed around midnight. Any device that appeared again and again in late-night scans would stand out. The early Police went public that afternoon. A short briefing asked for tips and released the anonymous hotline. Samantha's poster went up at markets, transit stops, hospital lobbies, and the corners where bar crowds passed. Volunteers coordinated with a community organizer, Riley, who had already built a social page to capture leads. The department monitored the page to keep rumors from drowning out real information. A safety advisory went out citywide, urging people to avoid late walks alone until more was known. Patrols increased near the boardwalk and bridge. Tips flooded in and pulled the search in many directions. Some callers claimed to see Samantha at a bar on the opposite side of town. Video proved otherwise. Someone said she was headed to the beach. Her phone data didn't support that. A man sleeping rough under the bridge was questioned because of proximity. His shoes didn't match. His routine matched witness timelines, and he had nothing linking him to the items found. Piece by piece, false trails were cleared, but each dismissal cost time. The lack of blood or signs of a fight challenged the standard robbery theory. Her wallet hadn't been taken. Her phone and bag were left at the scene. Detectives noted how quickly an offender could approach and control someone if the area was quiet, and how fast a body could be moved off the main path. But they lacked the image that could confirm it. The broken camera left a hole where answers should have been. Given the pattern, the department escalated the case from missing person to a criminal investigation. More personnel were assigned. Overtime was approved. The evidence went to a state lab and then to a federal lab for advanced workups, including low-template DNA and fiber comparison. Detectives expanded the camera radius to a full kilometer. Even if the bridge had gone dark, another lens might have caught a figure approaching or retreating. They also asked telecoms to analyze repeated late-night device presence near the bridge for several nights across the month. Offenders often rehearse or return. By nightfall on day 1, the working map was dense with colored pins. Each pin marked a camera, a sighting, a sound, or a piece of evidence. Heat maps showed where people clustered before midnight and how the streets emptied after. Investigators tried to pry it open. They compared license plate hits before and after midnight. One car circled twice, then left, but the driver was located and cleared. He'd been lost and looking for parking. They checked building keycard swipes at properties along the route. No anomalies. They studied ride-hailing data between 12:30 and 12:50. A veteran taxi driver, Mr. Ortiz, reported a call near 12:40 from the River Street area. The passenger never showed. The pickup pin placed him 2 blocks from the bridge. It didn't prove contact, but it showed confusion in the area just after the key window. The interviews deepened. The couple who saw the man in the dark jacket viewed a photo array and couldn't identify anyone with confidence. The resident who heard the cry walked the path with an officer. They stood at the window and listened to recorded samples to gauge direction and distance in similar weather. The output was still approximate at best. Without the bridge camera, a precise reconstruction felt just out of reach. Forensics worked through the physical items. The hat held a few fibers not consistent with Samantha's clothing. The bag offered touch points on the strap and zipper. The phone casing showed skin cells that could have been hers or transfer. The shoe print cast had enough detail to narrow possible models, but not enough to lock to a single brand. Nothing yet had the clarity needed to point to one person. Still, each test tightened controls for the next pass. Community pressure rose as days passed. Volunteers swept parks and riverbanks in wider arcs. The hotline kept ringing. Detectives triaged tips by proximity, time, and specificity. Leads with concrete times and cross-checks moved first. Vague claims fell to the bottom. The team stayed disciplined. They avoided chasing rumors and kept the focus on the route, the window, and the items at the river. Inside the command post, the case agent outlined a working theory. A rapid approach in a low visibility zone. A quiet control with little struggle. Immediate removal from the main path toward a vehicle or a concealed. On the 3rd day, the lab reported no immediate suspect DNA on the clothing or bag. That result was common. Many violent cases produce nothing clear at first pass. Detectives authorized extended testing, trace DNA, complex mixtures, more sensitive fiber analysis. They also requested database comparisons for the shoe tread and brought in a specialist to evaluate the video gaps. Could the bridge camera's failure be linked to a power fluctuation? Or had someone physically interfered with it? Logs suggested a simple fault, but the timing kept the question open. Even with these setbacks, the timeline grew sharper. The text at 12:12 stood like a post. The cry at 12:20, while unconfirmed, aligned with the camera outage and the location of the items. The taxi pin at 12:40 showed activity in the aftermath. And each interview with locals reinforced the same point. Samantha did not leave of her own free will. She didn't run. She didn't stage a disappearance. Something intersected her path. By the end of the initial phase, the investigation had structure but lacked a face. Officers knew the where, the when, and the likely how. They did not yet know the who. The city grew restless. The family stood in front of cameras and asked for information. The department doubled the reward. And still the board in the command post held more questions than answers. That is how the early search ended. With careful work, preserved evidence, narrowed windows, and no arrest. It wasn't failure, it was the foundation. The hat, the bag, and the phone were now sealed in evidence with their silent clues. The cast of the shoe prints sat on a shelf, waiting. The camera outage was documented to the second. The map of River Street, its lights, shadows, and blind corners was fixed in the file. From here, the case would move into the next phase, testing each lead for strength. The man in the dark jacket, the late taxi call, the anonymous account that messaged in the days before, the tread pattern that might match a pair of shoes owned by someone who... They started with the couple who saw the man in the dark jacket. Their walk home crossed River Street at about 12:10 to 12:15. They noticed a young woman ahead of them, same build and jacket color as Samantha, moving at an even pace. 10 to 15 feet behind her, a man in a dark coat. Not running, not talking, just there. The couple admitted the fog was thick along the water and the light was weak. They could not see his face. They could not swear it was Samantha, but the timing sat almost on top of her last text. That made their account a priority. The couple worked with an artist to build a rough sketch. Medium height, average build. Dark outer layer that reached the hips. Hands either in pockets or at his sides. Hair under a cap or hood, the witnesses did not agree. Detectives took the sketch and compared it to uniforms worn on late shifts in the area. Valets wore vests, not jackets. Dock workers wore reflective stripes. Hotel staff wore blazers. None matched the plain dark coat described by the couple. It was the kind of jacket anyone could own. Useful for a timeline. Not yet useful for an arrest. The team then mapped the path the couple walked and lined it up against camera coverage. One lens that faced the street showed a faint figure moving toward the bridge at 12:13. Another lens farther down recorded a second figure a few seconds later. The images were silhouettes at best. No face, no clear clothing details. But the movement fit. First the woman, then the man. The picture held together just long enough to raise hope and then faded back into grain. They marked the observation as directionally consistent and moved on. The cry at 12:20 came from a resident whose window overlooked the water. He could not tell whether the voice was male or female. It was short, like a sudden call, and then nothing. He did not look outside. He did not call 911. He went back to bed. When he heard about the disappearance the next day, he came forward. Detectives brought him back to the window. They replayed audio samples at different volumes to test distance and direction. The river masked sound. The wind carried it. The fog distorted it. The best estimate put the source somewhere near the bridge and the ramp to the river path. The account was logged as credible but imprecise. It didn't tell them who screamed. It only told them when the area was likely not safe. The taxi lead began with a name, Mr. Ortiz, a veteran driver. He reported a pickup request near 1240 within 2 to 3 blocks of the bridge. The passenger never appeared. Dispatch logs confirmed the call. GPS placed his car circling and then idling near a corner across from a small lot. Cell records placed his phone right there. The timing fell after the critical window. It could have been a frightened witness looking for a ride. It could have been someone else. It could have been the offender trying to leave quickly, but then changing plans. The tip was real. The meaning was not. Still, it put a moving piece on the map when the city was otherwise quiet. Physical evidence offered the most hope. The shoe print by the bridge had shape. Technicians cast it and scanned it. The pattern aligned with several men's models sold over a span of years. That range was both a clue and a curse. It ruled out Samantha's own footwear. It pushed the case away from an accident and toward contact with another person. But it did not point to a unique brand or a single soul. Detectives visited nearby maintenance shops and asked men to show their shoes. They looked at treads, they photographed and compared. A few were close, none were exact. The print went back in the box, kept for later when a suspect list would be stronger.
The hat, the bag, and the phone were more promising. The hat held fibers that did not match Samantha's clothing. The bag's strap had touch points where skin cells could cling. The phone had a power down within minutes of the 1212 text. Analysts pulled the system logs to see whether it had been shut off by the user, forced off, or drained to zero. The data suggested a sudden drop not consistent with a slow battery fade. That pointed to deliberate action. The items painted a scene with short contact and quick control. The wallet, still inside the bag, argued against a simple robbery. Whoever acted was focused on Samantha, not her money. Digital leads moved in parallel. Detectives had a list of accounts that messaged Samantha in the week before she vanished. One account stood out. No clear name, few followers, odd timing. With a court order, they requested the IP addresses and devices tied to that handle. They cross-checked those logins against locations near River Street on the night of the 14th. They also compared login times to local shift schedules. If the posts aligned with a night worker's hours, it would be a pattern. They asked social platforms for device fingerprints, mobile or desktop, operating system, app versions. The point was simple. Turn a blank name into a device. Turn a device into a person. The process took time, and early results were thin. Some logins routed through mobile networks with wide coverage. Others came from public Wi-Fi that also served dozens of devices. The task was slow, but not hopeless. To compensate for the broken bridge camera, the video team widened the net to 1 kilometer. Hotel lobbies, marina doors, parking lot exits, storefront windows, even glass facades that could reflect movement. They reconstructed a minute-by-minute timeline from 11:30 to 12:45. They logged anyone walking against the usual flow or circling back. They filtered for dark outerwear. They marked figures who appeared in one frame and then failed to appear where they should. A few silhouettes traced a path that fit the couple's account. None revealed a face. With the leads on the table, the team stress-tested the human stories. The couple's timeline was backed by a receipt and their phone's movement. That kept their account in play. The resident's claim of hearing a cry was checked against his phone activity. No calls or messages at that time, which made his memory cleaner but still vague. Mr. Ortiz's pickup was stamped by dispatch and GPS, making it one of the more reliable data points, even though its meaning remained unclear. A man sleeping rough under the bridge was questioned thoroughly. His shoes didn't match. No trace of Samantha was found on his belongings. He was removed from the field of view. Communication with the public required balance. Police needed eyes and ears. They did not need rumors. A press note asked for tips and emphasized specific asks. Sightings of a man in a dark jacket near River Street, and any vehicles stopping between 12 o'clock and 12:30. They did not publicize the camera outage or the shoe print pattern. That would invite confessions from people who only repeated what they heard on the news. Riley's community page helped, but it also amplified noise. The department worked with Riley to highlight leads tethered to photos, license plates, or precise times. Claims about bars across town or beach trips were quietly debunked and archived. As the days clicked forward, a working model began to harden. The offender used the dark stretch where streetlights failed. He approached quickly. He kept control quietly. He did not rifle the bag. He shut off the phone. He moved off the main path within minutes. The camera outage and the cry aligned with that sequence. The shoe print marked a point of contact. The man in the dark jacket fit the approach. The taxi call suggested someone trying to leave after the event, or a witness who saw something and got spooked. Each element supported the others without closing the loop. The gaps were clear. No face, no plate, no direct image of Samantha with another person. The phone had no recorded step spike toward a fight. The water and fog erased sounds and smudged shapes. Detectives doubled down on lab work. Meanwhile, the suspect pool took shape. Men who worked late or transited the path often. Men flagged by neighbors for staring or odd behavior. Men whose devices appeared in late-night Wi-Fi logs. Men who wore practical dark jackets for outdoor work. Alibis were checked and rechecked. A few men fell away with strong evidence of being elsewhere. Others held to stories that were thin but not provably false. Detectives ranked them by risk. Repeated presence, weak alibi, proximity to River Street, known complaints, and any overlap with the anonymous account. The emotional pressure built, especially on the family. But the investigation kept its line. The aim was not a fast headline. It was a clean chain. If a suspect emerged, the case had to survive court. That meant discipline in how evidence was collected and how tips were weighed. It meant not over-promising in press conferences. It meant telling the family the truth even when the truth was that nothing had broken yet. One detail kept nagging at investigators: preparation. If the offender rehearsed, he might have been seen in the same spot on nights before October 14th. He might have walked the route and timed the lights. He might have learned when the bridge camera often glitched. The team checked logs for repeated device IDs at the exact point where the shoe print was found. They looked for the same car circling on multiple nights. They asked night staff at nearby hotels if anyone had loitered near the ramp more than once. A pattern began to flicker. A device with no registered owner appeared near the bridge on 3 separate nights in the week before the crime, always after midnight, always for less than 10 minutes. It wasn't enough to identify a person, but it pointed to intent. Even so,
After the first long phase of Part 5, the case still lacked the one link that makes a prosecutor comfortable: a direct tie between Samantha's items and a specific individual. The shoe print was suggestive. The jacket sighting was suggestive. The cry was suggestive. The taxi call hinted at movement. The messages from the anonymous account were the only lead that could jump the gap. By the end of this stage, the investigation had pressure, structure, and a short list. The field had narrowed to people who matched the behavior model. Some showed up in late-night digital logs. Some had jobs that put them on the streets after midnight. Some had been reported for creeping around the neighborhood. Each would be tested harder in Part 6. Alibis would be broken down, minute by minute. Shoe tread would be compared again with higher precision. Device data would be tightened. And the anonymous account would either attach to a human being or fall away. What kept the team pushing was simple. The timeline was tight. The clues overlapped. The city was watching. The family needed answers. The science was getting better every month. Cases like this turn on patience and detail. The hat and bag held more than cloth and zippers. The phone remembered more than its last text. The bridge and the ramp had secrets in the dirt and air that careful work could still find. The night had gaps, but gaps can close. So Part 5 ends with the threads stretched but not yet tied. The man in the dark jacket remains a shape on a screen. The taxi call remains a missed connection. The cry anchors a minute. The shoe print marks a spot. The messages wait to be traced back to a device and a door. In Part 6, those threads will be pulled against competing theories: robbery, known acquaintance, accident, and against real people with names and schedules. Most will break. One will hold. And when it does, the case will move from speculation to proof. By the time weeks had passed, investigators faced the same question that gripped the public: what really happened to Samantha Lee? To move forward, they had to break the case down into possible explanations. 3 scenarios stood out: a robbery gone wrong, a tragic accident, or a deliberate attack by someone who knew her. Each theory was tested against the facts. The evidence would show which fit and which collapsed. The first theory was robbery. On the surface, it made sense. A young woman alone at night, walking through poorly lit streets, could become. The second theory was accident. That stretch of River Street had areas of low light and broken rails. On a foggy night, with mist rising from the water, some believed Samantha might have slipped. But again, the evidence resisted. Her hat, her bag, and her phone were not floating downstream. They were found clustered near the wooden walkway, as if removed or dropped in a controlled way. More telling was the footprint found near the bridge. It didn't match Samantha's shoe. If she had fallen on her own, why would there be a second person's print in the dirt? The accident theory began to unravel. That left the third scenario: a deliberate act. Someone had been following her, possibly waiting for the right moment. The clues supported it. Days before her disappearance, she received odd messages from an anonymous account. On the night itself, witnesses saw a man in a dark coat trailing a woman who looked like Samantha. Within minutes, her phone went silent, cut off with precision. Taken together, the signs pointed toward intent. This wasn't random. Someone had chosen her. From there, the focus shifted. Investigators asked who in this city might have had both access and motive. They began to look closely at people with reasons to be out late. Maintenance workers, security guards, dock hands, residents who lived near the river. Anyone who could cross paths with Samantha after midnight. They reviewed complaints from locals about men who stared too long at women or lingered around parking lots. These weren't yet suspects, but they were people worth examining more closely. The process was simple but relentless. Where were you that night? Can anyone confirm it? Were you working, at home, or out on the street? Do you own a dark jacket? What kind of shoes do you wear? Does your story remain the same when we ask again 2 weeks later? Each answer was logged, checked, and compared against what the physical evidence already suggested. Family and close friends were questioned hardest of all. Samantha's boyfriend, Ethan, her roommate, Grace, her co-workers. Attention kept circling back to the man in the dark coat. Witnesses couldn't describe his face. The fog and the distance blurred everything. But the outline was there, following her path along River Street, just minutes before she vanished. A nearby camera even picked up 2 faint silhouettes, one ahead believed to be Samantha, one just behind, taller, broader. The footage was grainy, but the timing was undeniable. Someone had been there, in her shadow. The messages from the anonymous account added another layer. Subpoenas went out to service providers. Investigators wanted to know who had logged into that profile, from what device, and from where. They compared the digital trail to people who spent time around the wooden walkway at night. If those data points overlapped, the anonymous chatter could transform into a suspect with a name. Investigators also watched for unusual behavior in the aftermath. Did anyone suddenly change shifts, stop showing up for work, trade in their shoes or clothing soon after October 14th? Did someone replace their phone or go silent on social media? Did anyone linger near the search areas or memorials, not as a grieving friend, but with strange interest? Small behaviors could open big doors. To strengthen their case, detectives reenacted parts of the night. Officers walked the route from the café to the bridge at the same time of night, in the same dim conditions, to measure how long it took. They tested whether a scream could be heard from nearby apartments. They arranged Samantha's belongings exactly as they had been found to see if they could fall naturally or if they looked deliberately placed. Each test ruled out chance and added weight to the theory of deliberate contact. By the second stage of the investigation, the conclusion was clear. Robbery was weak. Accident was unlikely. The signs of pursuit and control matched only one theory. Samantha had been targeted. Someone who knew her routine had approached in those minutes between 12:12 and 12:20. The pool of suspects narrowed. It now centered on men who lived or worked near River Street, men who were known to be around the bridge at night, men who couldn't fully explain where they were when Samantha vanished. Among them were 3 individuals investigators studied most. One was a worker who often passed through the wooden bridge after late shifts. His timeline the night of October 14th was vague. Another was a local resident, known for staring at women, whose whereabouts around midnight had no witness confirmation. The third was a maintenance man assigned to nearby buildings, often seen in dark clothing, whose shoes and habits resembled what little the case had. None of them were yet proven guilty, but each carried red flags. Detectives called this the short list. It didn't name names to the public, but within the department, those 3 men became the focus. Their routines were tracked, their statements tested for cracks. Items they discarded, even fibers or threads, were quietly collected to compare against the evidence. The investigation tightened like a net. Still, there was a problem. Suspicion alone wasn't enough. Witness memories were foggy, video was blurred, timelines were thin. What the case needed was a piece of evidence that could stand in court. A fiber, a trace, a connection that could transform possibility into certainty. And that was where science came in. Samantha's hat carried tiny threads not matching her own clothing. Her bag straps held faint touch marks, invisible to the eye. These were the kind of details that, for years, had been too small to mean anything. But technology was changing. By the time the case grew cold, labs had developed new methods capable of reading the smallest traces of DNA, isolating mixtures, and linking them back to a single individual. Detectives pinned their hopes on that. If one of the 3 men left even the smallest mark on Samantha's belongings. In 2022, 6 years after Samantha Lee vanished, her case file was still open, but cold. Detectives had chased tips, interviewed dozens of people, and tested every lead that came across their desks. Nothing had broken the silence. But science had not stopped moving. Across the country, new DNA techniques were producing results that were once thought impossible. That year, investigators decided to try again. They sent Samantha's wool hat and her handbag strap to a federal laboratory. The request was simple. Check them with the newest methods. Look for anything too small for the older technology to find. For months, the evidence had sat sealed in climate-controlled storage. The items had already been examined years earlier, with no usable results. But this time was different. The lab used next-generation sequencing and ultra-sensitive touch DNA analysis. The breakthrough came from the smallest traces. On Samantha's green knit hat, lab scientists found fibers mixed with sweat and skin cells. On the handle of her handbag, they recovered another microscopic sample. Both matched Samantha, but they also contained something else. A second profile. It belonged to a man. The lab compared that unknown DNA against the National Criminal Database. Within days, a match appeared. It was Mark Johnson, 34 years old, who had lived and worked only blocks from where Samantha disappeared. Johnson was not a stranger to Savannah police. He had a record for petty theft and trespassing. Several neighbors had once reported him for suspicious behavior, describing him as odd, sometimes aggressive. But no serious charges had ever stuck. He had never been linked to violence. Until now. The revelation electrified the investigation. For years, detectives only had fragments. A man in a dark coat spotted behind Samantha. A mysterious scream near the river. A shoe print that didn't belong to her. None of it added up. Now, for the first time, there was a name. That vague shadow described by a couple back in 2016 could finally be connected to a real person. Mark Johnson. Detective, the lab confirmed the match a second time. The probability of error was essentially 0. The DNA on Samantha's hat and handbag was his. Investigators knew they finally had the lead that could break the case wide open. Detectives quietly placed Johnson under surveillance. They watched his house, noted his routines, and collected his trash to confirm additional DNA samples. Everything lined up.
The same profile kept appearing. Each test tightened the circle around him. For Samantha's family, the news was delivered carefully. After years of waiting, the words were hard to believe. A suspect had finally been identified. A face, a name, and a record to go with the crime. The unknown man who had haunted them since 2016 now had a real identity. Police strategized the next steps. An arrest in a case this old required a strong foundation. They needed to show not only that Johnson's DNA was present, but also that he had the opportunity and the connection. His job gave him access to the streets where Samantha walked. His past gave him a pattern of unsettling behavior, and the forensic evidence tied him directly to her belongings. Investigators also revisited old witness statements. The couple who saw the man in the dark coat were shown photos of Johnson. They could not make a positive identification, but they said his build and height were consistent with what they remembered. Another resident recalled seeing Johnson loitering near the boardwalk around the same period. The threads began to form a picture. For Savannah police, the discovery represented more than a name. It showed the technology could revive even the most stubborn cases. What years of searching by hand could not uncover, a few microscopic traces had revealed. By mid-2023, detectives were ready. The district attorney reviewed the evidence and approved a warrant. In June, a team of officers approached Johnson's home. The neighborhood was quiet when unmarked cars rolled in. They knocked on his door. Inside, Johnson looked confused as officers moved in. He was placed in handcuffs and led outside while neighbors stood in shock. The arrest marked the first real breakthrough in 7 years. News spread within hours. Local television ran live coverage. The shift was clear. For years, Samantha Lee's case had been a haunting mystery, a story of a young woman vanishing into the fog without explanation. In 2022, the science changed that. It took a random fiber, a microscopic trace, and turned it into a name. Mark Johnson. That was the power of forensic progress. It gave detectives what eyewitnesses and old cameras could not. It moved the case from speculation to certainty. And it gave the community of Savannah the first real glimpse of justice. The next chapter would unfold in the courtroom, but the breakthrough had already altered everything. From that day forward, Samantha's disappearance was no longer just an unsolved story. It was a criminal case, with a suspect in custody, and the truth finally within reach. The DNA had spoken. A suspect finally had a name. Mark Johnson. But what happened when police showed up at his door in June 2023 shocked the entire city of Savannah. In the next part, we follow the arrest, the trial, and the community's reaction. Make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the moment this case explodes into the public eye. June 2023. After years of silence, police in Savannah moved in. Detectives and tactical officers surrounded a modest house not far from River Street. Inside lived Mark Johnson, the man whose DNA had been tied to Samantha Lee's belongings. Neighbors watched from their porches as officers knocked, then forced entry. Within minutes, Johnson was led out in handcuffs. He kept his head down, saying nothing. The quiet street erupted in whispers. Some filmed the scene on their phones. Others stood frozen, shocked that the man they had seen almost daily was now accused of a killing that haunted the city for 7 years. News spread instantly.
Local television interrupted programs to broadcast live footage. Anchors repeated the same phrase, "An arrest has been made in the Samantha Lee case." Newspapers printed bold headlines the next morning. One stood out above the rest: "The killer among us." For the people of Savannah, the revelation was hard to process. Johnson had lived and worked in the neighborhood for years. He fixed lights, repaired pipes, trimmed hedges. Residents remembered greeting him in passing or hiring him for small jobs. He blended into the background, someone no one ever suspected. Now those same neighbors were horrified, realizing the man they trusted with house keys and repairs was the same man accused of stalking and killing Samantha. For Samantha's family, the arrest was both painful and relieving. Her mother broke down in tears when detectives called to confirm the news. She had waited 7 long years for an answer. The pain of losing her daughter was still raw, but now there was someone to hold accountable. Samantha's younger brother spoke at a brief press gathering outside their home. His words were simple: "At least now we know who did this. At least we have a name." Days later, the family appeared at a press conference with police officials. They thanked investigators for never giving up, and the community for standing by them through years of uncertainty. Cameras captured every moment. Their gratitude mixed with sorrow became one of the most powerful images of the case. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. Prosecutors framed it simply. Johnson was not a stranger in the shadows. He knew the area, knew Samantha, and had opportunity. Combined with the DNA, the case grew strong. Johnson, however, refused to admit guilt. At his first court appearance, he shook his head repeatedly. Through his attorney, he claimed the DNA evidence was planted or contaminated. His defense pointed to what they called possible chain of custody issues. They questioned how the items were stored for years before being retested. They argued that without a body, without eyewitnesses who could positively identify him, there was no proof of murder. But prosecutors pushed back hard. They reminded the jury that DNA is not guesswork. The probability of the sample belonging to anyone other than Johnson was near zero. They highlighted the consistency of the timeline, the matching witness accounts, and Johnson's presence in the neighborhood at crucial hours. "DNA does not lie," the lead prosecutor said firmly, looking straight at the jury. The trial became one of the most closely followed events in Georgia that year. The courtroom was filled each day with reporters, locals, and members of Samantha's family. The front rows were occupied by her mother and brother, who listened intently, sometimes wiping tears as testimony unfolded. The case was broadcast daily, and headlines called it the Savannah Shock. Public opinion was divided. Some residents insisted Johnson seemed harmless and could not have done it. Others believed the evidence was overwhelming and demanded the maximum sentence. Outside the courthouse, debates broke out. The community was still trying to reconcile the handyman they once trusted with the accused killer standing in front of them. The proceedings stretched on, with experts testifying, attorneys clashing, and jurors taking careful notes. Finally, after days of deliberation, the jury returned. The verdict was clear: guilty. Johnson was convicted on charges of murder and unlawful restraint. The sentencing was swift. The judge declared Johnson would serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. No release, no second chance. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars. The community leaders called the outcome a lesson in patience and determination. Detectives said it showed why cold cases should never be forgotten. Reporters framed it as justice finally delivered, even if delayed. Ordinary citizens described a strange mix of emotions: sadness for what happened, relief that answers came, and unease knowing the danger had once lived so close. 7 years after Samantha vanished, justice had finally caught up with her killer. But the story was not finished. Her family and her city still carried the scars of her loss. They wanted more than a conviction. They wanted remembrance. They wanted Samantha's name to mean something beyond tragedy. In the weeks after the trial, plans began for a public memorial and a scholarship fund in her honor. Savannah prepared to close one chapter and begin another, one focused not on the crime, but on the life taken too soon. The verdict stands: life without parole for Mark Johnson. No appeals left that could change the core truth. The court read the sentence. The room went still. For 7 years, this case pulled on the city like a heavy tide. Now the law drew a line. The file moved from active to closed, not because the city forgot, but because the evidence held. The police announced the end of the primary investigation. They shifted to supporting the family, helping the community, and keeping the lessons alive. Outside the courthouse, Maria Lee spoke first. She did not give a long speech. She said, "We have an answer." It was enough. Alex stood next to her and thanked the officers and the volunteers who never stopped showing up. The family's lawyer thanked the lab teams who did the work few people see. Reporters asked about relief, about grief, about what comes next. The family promised one thing: Samantha's name would not be tied only to fear. It would carry hope. 2 weeks later, the city gathered at the square near River Street. It was the same area where Samantha walked most nights and where her belongings were found. Candles lined the steps. A photograph stood on an easel. In front of it lay a green knit hat. The family launched the Samantha Lee Scholarship that same month. It supports students in graphic design and tourism, 2 fields Samantha loved and understood. The rules are simple. Show strong work. Propose a project that gives back to Savannah. Keep your grades up. Each year, recipients present their projects in a small gallery space near River Street. Posters line the walls. Tour maps designed by students sit next to photo essays about the river, the history, and the people who keep the street alive at night. Donors can see where their money goes. Clear accounts, public updates, no confusion. The scholarship keeps Samantha's name in a classroom, not just in a headline. The city placed a small bronze plaque along the walkway by the water, close to where the hat and bag were found. It bears 3 simple words: remember, report, protect. A QR code sits beside it. Scan it, and you land on a page that lays out the timeline, the evidence, and the lessons. No lurid details, just facts, tip numbers, and guidance on what to do if you feel followed at night. The plaque is not a shrine to fear. It is a marker for action. People stop, read, and move on with a sharper eye. Savannah learned hard lessons. When someone watches you or makes you uncomfortable, say it out loud. Tell a friend. Tell security. Call it in. Walk with someone after dark. Share your route. Check in when you get home. The city fixed broken lamps and added cameras where the footing is uneven and the corners turn blind. Police increased patrols during the last trains of the night and the first trucks of the morning.
Owners of late-night shops now keep a simple checklist by the register. Call a cab for anyone who asks, walk them to the door, and keep the camera facing the street. The case changed the department, too. Investigators updated how they store evidence. Every item from a violent crime or a suspicious disappearance now gets preserved for future testing, not just current tools. Cold case detectives train with lab scientists each quarter. They learn what trace DNA means in real-world settings and how to avoid contamination from day one. The unit now tracks advanced
Media outlets closed their series with context. They aired a final program that walked through the case minute by minute. They showed the last video from the café, the search efforts, the broken camera gap, and the decision to retest the evidence in 2022. They explained the DNA match in plain words and why chain of custody matters. Stories reminded viewers to avoid online witch hunts. Do not turn neighbors into suspects based on rumors. Let the evidence speak. Remember the victim. Respect the family. Behind the scenes, practical help continued. The district attorney's office connected the Lees with counseling. Nonprofits helped set up structures for the scholarship and provided guidance on transparent budgets. Volunteers signed up to keep the memorial page fresh and accurate. The police assigned a liaison to the family for any new tips or questions. The relationship between the city and the family did not end with the sentence. It changed shape. It moved from the urgency of a search to the steadiness of support. City Hall published a safety plan with dates and budgets, lights repaired, cameras added near the wooden footbridge. A patrol overlap added between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. at River Street and the side streets that feed into it. Emergency call boxes installed near the ramps to the water. Clear signs that mark the safest route home from the café district. None of it brings Samantha back. All of it reduces risk for someone else. That is how a city honors a loss, by closing the gap that allowed it. City Hall published a safety plan with dates and budgets. Lights repaired, cameras added near the wooden footbridge. A patrol overlap added between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. at River Street and the Sack Streets that feed into it. Emergency call boxes installed near the ramps to the water. Clear signs that mark the safest route home from the café district. None of it brings Samantha back. All of it reduces risk for someone else. That is how a city honors a loss, by closing the gap that allowed it. Out of this case came 3 clear lessons. Justice can arrive late, but it can still arrive. Evidence beats rumor. Process beats speculation. And when a community keeps its eyes open, posting flyers, sharing tips, showing up, small details multiply into answers. Savannah did that. The lab did that. The detectives did that. The family never stopped pushing for it. The emotional weight remains, but it shifts. There is pain, yes. There is also a place to put it. A scholarship application, a candle in the square, a moment spent walking a friend to her car. The name Samantha Lee is no longer only the name of a victim. It is written at the top of acceptance letters for scholarships, on plaques in studio classrooms, and on programs for student showcases. That is not closure. It is continuity. The city looks back and steps forward. The final images are simple. Sunset over the river. A line of candles that flicker and hold. A small plaque that asks 3 things of every passerby. Remember what happened. Report what you see. And protect each other on the walk home. The narration repeats the 3 anchors of this story. October 14th, 2016. The night a short walk turned into a missing person case.
The year 2022, when retesting the hat and bag pulled a hidden signature into the light. June 2023, when a jury heard the science and a judge imposed the maximum sentence allowed. 20 minutes on a dark street, 6 years of waiting, and a lifetime in prison. That is the arc. It is the victory of steady work over silence. This case does not end with applause. It ends with a promise. Savannah will not waste what it learned. The police will preserve evidence for the next breakthrough. The lab will keep pushing for clearer methods. The community will keep the lights on, literally and figuratively. And the family will keep opening doors for students who share Samantha's craft and drive. Tell us what you learned from this 7-year fight for answers. Share what safety habits you keep when you walk home at night. If this story moved you, comment, like, and subscribe. Help us keep these lessons in the light. In our next episode, we follow a different cold case that seemed impossible, until one small detail turned the entire file. Stay with us for that turn.